I shall have Ida Scudder's face looking at me as I speak, just to keep me in line here. Well, thank you so much, Kate and everybody, for the wonderful way in which you have looked after our family as we've been here in these last few days. It's been a very meaningful time, and we are indeed honored to represent the family. I wish that my mother could be here. She certainly longed to be. The best that we can do is that I am wearing her sari. Which some of you might remember. This is the place where my parents, Paul and Margaret, were, I believe, at their happiest as they began their great life's work. I would like just to start briefly by saying, however, that our joy at being here is mixed with sorrow as we arrived just in time to say farewell to our dear friend Augustine, whose loss reminds us that the work of the Lord is sometimes accomplished at great cost. This is, for us, a special homecoming. However, at this moment, I see only a very few faces that I recognize here. But my excuse is that as the baby of the family, I have the fewest memories of this place. My mementos are a scar on the back of my head from falling out of a tree near the small bungalow, and a lifelong passion for the color green that I believe was born out of loyalty for Cochrane House. Not knowing the vast majority of you allows me to say, therefore, in all honesty, you haven't changed a bit. You've never looked better. Some things have changed around the place. Small bungalow doesn't seem to be called that anymore, for one thing. The buildings seem bigger, trees taller, but it's reassuring to see on the sides of the buildings the names of the people who began the great work of the college and hospital. Scudder, of course, Cochrane, Gass, Cauchy. They are there everywhere, reminding us that the purpose and spirit of this place has not changed. This is still more than ever a place of healing, and teaching, and worship of the God who is our great physician. A God who changes the name of the wounded to whole, of the desolate to joyful. I have been thinking about names, perhaps because of the joy of seeing my father's name on the buildings at the hospital, and it brought to mind a moment from my childhood that I would like to tell you about. This was after we left India. We were living in America. I was 12 or so, and one evening I was sitting on the living room couch watching Star Trek on TV. And if you don't know the show, you haven't missed anything. Dad did not like Star Trek, but he said nothing when he came in and sat down on the couch with me as though he wanted to watch Captain Kirk zap the aliens. And then he reached over to where I was sitting with my feet tucked up to the side on the sofa, and he took one of my feet and held it in his hands. Now, as anyone who's ever been treated as a patient by my father will tell you, no one could hold a foot with greater tenderness. Cradling my heel in his hands, he gently pressed my toes down and back, flexing and extending. But then he began to examine my foot, apparently to satisfy himself that all appropriate bones, joints, and tendons were present and in the correct locations. I doubt that anyone in this august assembly needs reminding, but there are 26 bones in the human foot, 52 in both, a quarter of all the bones in the body, and I can tell you with complete confidence that I have them all. In addition, he undertook to test the range of rotation in the joints of my toes. Tenderness, by now, had given way to scientific rigor, and while I squeaked in protest, his expression remained one of concentration with a hint of mischief. I learned that it is impossible to follow an episode of Star Trek while someone is exploring the potential degree of rotation in your proximal interphalangeal joint. I know that's the name for that joint because getting me to stop watching Star Trek was not Dad's only goal that day. Throughout the therapeutic massage session, he was naming each part of the foot as he isolated it between finger and thumb. Posterior tibialis, he said, as if to himself. Cuboid, navicular. On and on, murmuring like a priest working his way through the rosary. And he worked his way through the litany of my foot. Lateral cuneiform, first metatarsal, distal phalange. He recited the workings of my foot with the cadence and reverence he would have given Kipling or Tennyson. Flexor hallucis brevis, extensor digitorum longus. In this way, he gave me the names of parts of myself, like a series of gifts. Invisible to me, they were clear in his mind's eye. And in their meaning, he spoke out his admiration for the design of the human foot in general, and my magnificent foot in particular. When he was done, I had to look at my foot to be sure that was the one he was talking about. Because let me tell you, at that time in my life, magnificent was not a term I would have applied to myself. Like a lot of kids at that age, I had a litany of my own, based on examination of myself in the mirror. And it went: mousy hair, buck teeth, pudgy tummy, freckles. Magnificent? No. My name was unlovable. But in that moment it was clear to me that he had an authority in this matter that I could not question, and that something larger was taking place. That day, he set me on the path to understanding that I am indeed fearfully and wonderfully made. I tell that story because I know Dad was doing what every graduate of this school has done since Ida Scudder taught her first students, whenever they encounter the wounded and broken, the ones who call themselves unlovable. He used the gift of healing touch and his trained mind and his God-centered spirit to tell me not just the names of all the bones of my foot, but also the name by which I and all of us and all of those whom you serve have been known by God since before we were born. The name Beloved. So I am honored to accept the citation as a witness and as a beneficiary of this man's extraordinary gifts. Thank you.
Or you could leave them on and order pizza for all of us. It's good to be back in Vellore. It's been 25 years since I was here. A lot has changed. Many of you students were not yet born. My hair was even then Garfunkel-like, although brown, not gray. And the hospital is much larger now than it was then. Most importantly, however, the last time I was here, every other time I was here, I was accompanied by Drs. Paul and Margaret Brand, whose legacy we are here to celebrate. I noticed that most of you students ended up on the balcony because you're the only ones who can still climb stairs, I think. And as I thought through what I might say to you, I would summarize it in one sentence, and that is, please don't move to my country, the United States. And I don't say that because I'm anti-immigration. Actually, many of our best doctors, our best nurses, our best IT personnel come from India. I say that for your own sake, because if you did move to my country, you would be in great danger of missing some of the most important lessons in life. As a Westerner, I look back at what I've learned about India, primarily through the eyes of Paul Brand, who was a lover of this country. We spent 10 years together. I interviewed him here, and in Karagiri, and in London, and in Louisiana, and in Seattle, and really his life seems divided into three phases. There's the British phase, where a lot of his education took place. There's the India phase, where most of his creative work took place. And then there was the United States phase, where he ended up, and where I got to know him first. I found the best way to get to know a doctor is to interview their operating room scrub nurses. They tell you the real truth. It's extraordinary that in only 17 years of service in this place, he changed medicine remarkably. He devised procedures in hand surgery which are still used, still written about today. Some of you in this room still practice them. He changed forever the treatment and the understanding, the perception of the oldest and most feared disease, leprosy, Hansen's disease. And not only that, the lessons he learned in that period of time were applied to many other diseases of insensitivity. I once interviewed the Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. C. Everett Koop, and he said Dr. Brand's contributions probably saved about 50,000 amputations per year in the United States when they were applied to diseases like diabetes. For me, though, he contributed far more. My own father died when I was just 1 year old, so I have no memories of him at all. And I truly believe that at one point God said, I'll show you what a real father is like, and gave me Paul Brand. I remember speaking at his memorial service, and as I reflected back on our life, because when I first came to him, my own faith was in question. I was recovering from a very unhealthy, I call it a toxic church, and I went through a period where I wasn't sure what to believe. And I couldn't have written very convincingly about my own faith. And I said at that service, we had an unusual exchange, Paul Brand and I, whereas I was giving words to his faith, he was in that very process giving faith to my words. Because I would have had great difficulty writing with integrity and confidence about what I believed. I had no problem writing with integrity and confidence about Paul Brand. I've never met a person who was a deeper thinker. Every question, every doubt that I brought up to him, thinking I would stump him, I realized he had thought about long and hard in several languages. I never surprised him. And tenderly and graciously, he would share what he had learned. He was a man who lived with paradoxes, and I want to give you three of those paradoxes that have helped my own journey and that would be difficult for you students, especially, to learn in my country, the United States. The first one is what I call the paradox of reductionism. We in the West are great at breaking things apart. We digitize, we break apart atoms, the human genome, the DNA molecule. We reduce all of reality to digital ones and zeros. And there are some great things that come out of that. Some of the machines in the hospital that we looked at today came out of that procedure of reductionism. I have in my pocket, I'm sorry, I don't have a smartphone. I live in a canyon, I don't get good reception, so I have a dumb phone. But I have an iPod Touch. And even though I'm 7,000 miles from my home, I can stay in touch with my assistant. I can go on Facebook. I can listen to all of Beethoven's symphonies. I can access 20 million books through Google just with this little device in my pocket. So there's something very good about reductionism, but there's something very dangerous as well. People in the younger generations live in virtual reality, but virtual reality is always less than real reality. In the United States and other countries, we have these coffee places called Starbucks. I haven't seen them in Vellore yet. They're in Mumbai. I saw them on the way. And if you go into Starbucks, you can find teenagers who are sitting one table apart, emailing, texting each other. Not speaking, texting each other. And they count their social skills by how many friends they have on Facebook, many of whom they've never met. A friend that you've never met is not a friend, my friends. We've learned to deconstruct literature more than read. And in medicine, the great danger of reductionism is that you treat cells and diseases and not persons. And I learned from Paul Brand what it's like to treat persons. You who are in medicine are invited into the most tender and vulnerable moments of a patient's life. And if you go to a medical school in the United States, you'll learn you should never spend more than 7 minutes with a patient. And now, because they've electronified medicine, that 7 minutes is spent mostly while you're typing notes into your laptop computer, not even looking at the patient. Meanwhile, the most important things about that person, not the cell, not the disease, but the person, allergies, sleep habits, religious faith, family, stresses, diet, you'll never find out because you don't get them in a reductionistic world. Dr. Brand lived in an age when he treated persons. I've interviewed some of those people. One patient particularly named Saragopan, who we often wrote about, Sadan, he said, "You can call me because I'm from America. I don't know how to say those things." Sadan was quite a character. I remember his house. He looked a lot like Gandhi. He was very thin, bald head, little glasses, and he would sit cross-legged on his bed. And I was there when he recounted his story. It took him about half an hour. Many of the patients that Paul and Margaret Brand treated were from the lower caste, lower classes, not Sadan. He came from a successful family and had planned to be a success. But then one day he got spots on his arm that were suspicious. His schoolmates started treating him differently, and when the disease, Hansen's disease leprosy, was diagnosed, everything changed. His own family kicked him out. His own village asked him to leave. And he heard that there were 4 million people with that disease in India in those days, but there was only one orthopedic surgeon willing to work on them. He made his way to this city. He couldn't get here all the way because the bus driver found out he had leprosy and kicked him literally with his foot off the bus. And here was this educated, gentle man whose feet were wrapped in bandages. By the time he got to Katagiri, on the porch of the Brand home, Every step he took left a spot of blood on the dust behind him. He told me this story. It took half an hour, a wrenching story of shame and suffering and humiliation. And at the end, in his sing-song voice, he said, "But I am very happy that I had this disease." And I said, "Well, Sedan, how can you say this? I've rarely heard such a touching story. How can you say you're happy?" He said, "Because if I had not had this disease, I would have pursued material goods and success and prestige, and I would never have met Paul and Margaret Brand and the God who lives in them." Sedan was a reconstructed person, not a deconstructed person. I heard the series of surgeries again and again as Paul Brand worked to remake his feet, to remake his hands, and Margaret Brand worked on his eyes. You don't get that in 7 minutes with a laptop computer. At the same time, those of you in medicine have something not only to receive from your patients, but to give. Dr. Brand told me the story of once when he had given a diagnosis and a prescription to this woman to treat her husband. And as it continued throughout the hospital, he felt there was a shadow following him around. And whenever he turned around, here was this woman following him around. And he turned around, he admitted, even in a little bit of irritation, and said, "Excuse me, we have already treated your husband, right?" "Yes." And I gave you the prescription, right?" "Yes." Well, go to the pharmacy and get the prescription filled. "I have done this." "Well, why don't you give the prescription to your husband?" "Oh, Dr. Brand, could you give it with your good hands?" With your good hands. And he told me that Ida Scudder, in her day, with childbirth and even some simple surgeries, the patients would say to her, "I don't need anesthetic. Just hold my hand. Just hold my hand." A few years ago, I had an accident, a life-threatening accident, and I learned a little bit about good bedside manner and bad bedside manner. I was in a car. It was a snowy day where I live in Colorado, a state of many mountains. I hit a patch of ice, and suddenly the car grabbed gravel on the side of the road and started turning over and over 5 times in all down a cliff. Ambulance came before long, took me to a clinic, and this clinic, even though it was in rural Colorado in a small town, happened to have a CT scan machine, but they didn't have a radiologist, so they sent everything to Australia by satellite to be diagnosed. Meantime, I'm lying there strapped in, and the doctor came, and if they taught a course in bedside manner at his school, he flunked it. Because he started by saying, "Well, Mr. Yancey, it seems that you have a broken neck." I said, "Well, that's bad." He said, "Yes, it is. It's what we call a comminuted fracture. It's in a lot of different pieces. And but the good news is it's not right next to your spinal cord, so you're not in immediate danger of paralysis." "Oh, well, that's good." "Well, yes and no. It's right next to the carotid artery, so you're actually in immediate danger of dying." "Oh, that's bad." "Yes, well, we have a jet standing by to fly you to Denver for emergency surgery, but just between you and me, I must tell you that if the carotid artery is leaking, you're not going to make it to Denver. So here's a mobile phone. You should call the people you love and tell them goodbye, just in case." You see the difference in perspective. The doctor had one thing in mind. What is the appropriate diagnosis? I had my whole life in mind. Am I going to be paraplegic the rest of my life? Is there going to be a rest of my life? If this is the last 5 minutes, I should say something profound, and my wife could write an article and, make some money. The doctor was concerned about one thing, a reductionist approach to the human being. I was concerned about everything, my whole life as a human being. Paul Brand put together the Paradox of Reductionism. He used machines. He knew how to use electron microscopes. He knew how to dissect nerves. And yet he put together life. He constructed rather than deconstructed. As he looked through a microscope at individual cells, seeing the nucleus and the different parts of the cells, and then he would look into the sky and see galaxies and stars and planets. He saw the same designer at work in each one. And he gave a series of chapel talks here at this college. After we'd been together for a while, he said, I tried writing a book one time. I said, well, where is it? He said, I don't know, let's look. And we looked all over, and finally, at the bottom of his sock drawer, there was a little 90-page manuscript on what used to be called India paper. I think it was the 5th carbon copy, all smeared and smudged. And I sat up all night reading. I said, this is gold. Why hasn't this been published? It had been given 25 years before. And from that little manuscript, which came out of those chapel talks here in this place, 2 books came, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, and In His Image. Dr. Brand knew the difference between taking apart and putting together, from deconstructing to reconstruction. This school, of course, birthed the New Life Center, and I guess is going to rebirth the New Life Center, which is about restoring and honoring human beings. I have met and interviewed many of the leprosy patients that the Brands treated. There is no way that you can justify the lengths to which they went, surgery after surgery, on a bottom line. But they didn't treat people according to a bottom line. They treated people, including some of the lowest class people on the planet, in those days called untouchables, now Dalits, with leprosy, rejected by their own families, by their own villages, and they would invest their great skill, their great education, because they believed in each one of those people is the image of God, as Pauline so clearly expressed, her father conveyed to her. That's not something reducible, and I hope that this institution and those of you who go out from here will never forget it. The first paradox is the paradox of reductionism. The second is what I call the paradox of happiness. My introduction to Paul Brand came about because of this little booklet. My wife was working in a medical supply house, and she was going through a closet. And I was in the process of writing my very first book. I was 27 years old. It's a book called Where is God When It Hurts? And I was going to libraries reading book after book on the problem of pain, the curse of pain. And when she brought home this brochure, it talked about the gift of pain. No one else had talked to me about the gift of pain. And as I read it, I was amazed. And out of the blue, I called Paul Brand up. He was living in Louisiana, and said, could I come and interview you? I've never read anything like this. I don't know. I'm pretty busy around here. Well, I'll just sit in the hallway, and anytime you have 5 minutes, maybe a coffee break, I could ask you a few questions. We could go out to dinner at night. Well, I guess so. And that's how it all began. I took a plane and drove to this plantation, got to know them so well, and that began a 10-year collaboration and many more year friendship. And in this book, Dr. Brand talks about his own discoveries of happiness. He said that most people think if pain is over here, happiness is over here. And that's certainly true in my country. We've got a pill for anything. And pain is the enemy. And if you feel the slightest headache, this one will solve it in 3 minutes, not 4 minutes. So you better take this one. And if a woman feels any pain at all in childbirth, watch out. She's going to call a lawyer and sue you. We don't like pain. Dr. Brand discovered, it was new to me at least, that pain and happiness are not at polar opposites, rather they work together. He said, life is with a capital L, and it's as if there's a peak going up with both life, with happiness and pain pointing in the same direction. And he went on to say that the peak of happiness that, say, an Olympic athlete feels, that a great musician feels, that a rock climber feels, inevitably involves pain. It involves struggle. It involves challenge. And the experience of ecstasy is only realizable with that struggle, with that pain. He said, if I drew a graph today, it would have a single central peak with a surrounding plane. The peak would be life with a capital L, and would be the point at which pain and pleasure meet, while all around would be sleep, or death, or indifference. I had never seen anything like that, and I started trying to practice it. I was a scared kid. I grew up without a father. I was sheltered. I was skinny. I wasn't athletic, and I started to take it seriously, and I started running. I started climbing mountains. I started doing races, doing marathons, and I learned that it's absolutely true. That the more we flee any kind of struggle, any kind of pain, the more we eliminate the possibility for the deepest kind of happiness. There's a paradox. If she heard you use a word that wasn't in her list of approved words, or horrors, if she saw you smoking a cigarette, watch out. Saints don't countenance that kind of stuff. Granny Brand lived the life of a saint. You saw the pictures of her with the 2 sticks riding a horse up until age 95, going out into the villages. Her son, Paul Brand, was not a saint in that mold. He's what I would call a semi-saint. A semi-saint is someone who is just as devoted to God, is just as committed to following the way of Jesus, but knows how to use an electron microscope, knows how to dissect, knows how to enjoy a good meal now and then, unlike Granny Brand. In the United States, it's hard even to be a semi-saint. I've talked to many medical students, and the average person graduating from medical college in the United States owes about $150,000. Many of them go into medical school intending to go into a life of service and missions, and especially right after they get out, they want to go and spend a few years doing tropical medicine, going to a place where they can really feel used, but they're unable to because they've got that $150,000 debt. So they get a job and they start paying off that debt, but the seduction of anti-sainthood gets to them. And then they want a little nicer car, and then they want a little bigger house, and, well, maybe I'll raise some kids who will be missionaries, and I'll pursue the American dream. And that's what happens actually when many people from your country come to my country. They start being seduced by the American dream. The reason I want you to stay in India is because you can still be a semi-saint. And there's a place for that. Some say that Mahatma Gandhi helped set your nation free. Yes, but it was Ambedkar who wrote the Constitution, right? Ida S Scudder, Paul Brand, these were semi-saints. Committed, devoted, but they knew how to manage, they knew how to operate, they knew how to build buildings, They left a legacy that we enjoy today. Jesus started the whole Christian movement, but it was the Apostle Paul who got it organized. There's a place for semi-saints. You would have a hard time learning that in the United States. We know all about happiness. It's guaranteed in our Constitution: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But we missed the lesson that Paul Brand taught me, that happiness is not the opposite of pain and challenge and struggle. The two go together. The ideal of happiness in the United States would be sitting in front of a television in a comfortable chair, watching one of our 500 television channels, maybe drinking a glass of wine, and as you do that night after night, true happiness will pass you by. The third paradox is what I call the paradox of success. And that's the most important reason to stay away from the United States. Because there, success is all about accumulating material goods and prestige and titles and status. We judge as successful the one who gives orders, who rakes in the profits, who accumulates more and more. Regrettably, I hear some of the same things happening in India. In a lot of the country, medical doctors don't want to go into villages. They only want to go to the big cities. I hear about the kickbacks. If you order this product rather than that product, I hear about the bribes. I hear about the corruption that extends into medicine. I hear about how difficult it is to recruit medical workers to go to places of deep need. And then I come to this place and I hear of systems that are put in place not only to encourage but to require graduates. You realize, I'm sure, that this is the cheapest medical education in the entire world. And they just ask you to give some of that back in service to your fellow humans. And the reason why people like Ida S Scudder and Paul Brand are constantly put before you is because they indeed came to show a different way of success. As a journalist, I have interviewed a lot of people in my time. They tend to fall into two categories. There's one category that I call stars. And they're the people that we like to put on our magazines and profile in our television programs. They're the famous people, the athletes, the wealthy people, the movie stars, the Bollywood stars, the singers. And I remember when I first, as a young journalist, got to go to these people, I thought, man, wouldn't it be great to be Art Garfunkel or Lady Gaga? And yet, as I got to know some of these people and interviewed them, nosy journalist, I would say, excuse me, could I use your bathroom? And I'd lock the door and open their medicine cabinet and see how many pills it took them to get through one day. And you know the success rate of marriages in Hollywood, right? Doesn't exist. It's a failure rate. And I found that many of the people that we emulate, that we want to be like, actually don't even like themselves. One reason they work so hard to be in the public eye is because there's a little voice inside them that tells them, you're no good. And they have to prove, I'm okay, to the rest of the world. There's another category called servants. And I got to know that category, people like Paul Brand. I was attracted to him first because of his humility. Virtually everyone else I ever wrote about wanted me to make them look better. Couldn't you leave this part out? Couldn't you pop this up a little bit? Paul Brand always tried to get me to make him look worse. You know, that really wasn't my idea. That was Ernest Fritchie's. Well, there was a whole team of us, actually. I don't think you should put that in there. And I would fight these battles with him because we knew how great he was. And you know how great he was. But he was deeply humble at the core. Just in Mumbai the other day, I heard a telling story of Paul Brand. A medical student came here from another state and a rural place, and was kind of overwhelmed by Vellore, and it's a little hard to find your way around the campus, right? And he showed up, and he didn't know where to go, and he had all of his belongings in the suitcase, and no one seemed around. And then he saw this gardener working on some plants and some rather unfashionable clothes, and he stopped and said, "Excuse me, do you know where the dorm is, where medical students go?" He says, come in, have a cup of tea." And then he took his bags and brought them and installed him and explained where the buildings were and what the procedure was. And he said, boy, he knows a lot for a gardener. And later he found out he was the dean at the medical school, Paul Brand. Classic story of Paul Brand. Paul Brand also taught me about downward mobility. He was either first or second in his class. I think Margaret beat him out a couple of times, right? In the best medical school in England. And he came here and ended up working among some of the most neglected people on the entire planet. And yet, when he did so, he never felt sorry for himself. In fact, of the people I've interviewed, I've never met a more thankful and joyful couple than Paul and Margaret Brand. Do you know the statement that Jesus made, which is repeated more often than any other, 6 times? It's this, and it goes in different words in different parts of the Gospels, and I'll paraphrase it. He said, "You don't find your life by accumulating more and more, the American way. That's not how you find your life. You find your life by giving it away in service to others, and in the very process of giving it away, you find it. You find your life by losing it. That's how you actually find it." That principle was lived out for me in Paul Brand, because even though from one perspective it looks like he was giving away so much, he never thought that. And in the very process of what looked like giving away, he found enjoyment, happiness, fulfillment, meaning that is rare. The church over the years has done many things wrong, but one thing they've done right is the treatment of leprosy patients. There's a reason for that. Back in the Middle Ages, there was a crazy rumor that went around that Jesus himself had leprosy. A lot of rumors happened in the Middle Ages, but this one tracked back to someone who had read Isaiah 52 and 53. It was a prophecy. It described the crucifixion, and it described Jesus as one so disfigured from whom men turned their faces. And so reading that, somebody said, well, he must have had leprosy. And people went around and said, well, we need to treat people with leprosy as if they were Jesus. And they gathered them together, and actually in the Middle Ages there were 20,000 leprosy centers in Europe. They were called lazareti, after Lazarus in Jesus' story of Lazarus and the beggar, or the beggar Lazarus and the rich man. And sure enough, by the way they treated those with leprosy, eventually the disease became virtually extinct in Europe. And for a long time, there was that tradition of Christians who treated leprosy patients when no one else would. And virtually all of the great advances in the treatment of leprosy came from missionaries, Robert Cochrane, Paul Brand, Margaret Brand, and Ernest Fritchie, these people, and many of them connected with this school. Speaking of recognizing the image of God in every person, what I learned in watching Paul Brand and others like him is that they gave nothing away by reaching down, by downward mobility. They were the ones who gained. You've heard about some of the awards that he got, the Albert Lasker Award, the Humanitarian Professorship, the commander of the British Empire. Is there still a British Empire? Award. And even today, there are people who come from all over the world to this institution, to Karagiri down the road, to this neglected place, this hard-to-get-to place, I find, because of the contributions and the sacrifice of these people. My last visit 25 years ago, I went to the Kali Hills, where Paul Brand grew up, where Granny Brand is buried. It took a while to get there. The roads weren't very good. And then we started hitting the hills, and there's one highway that goes up like this. There are 70 hairpin turns to get to the top. And this being India, each one is carefully labeled, 39 over 70, 40 over 70. So you kind of know how many you have to go. We were quite late. We were over 2 hours late. And I thought, do these people know where they're going? Is this driver lost? We kept turning down these gravel roads and then a dirt road. And then suddenly we went over a hill, and I saw a sight that I'll never forget. There were about 200 people gathered there. The women decked out in their best saris. They looked like beautiful tropical birds, with colors glowing. And they surrounded the car, and they started singing hymns. And then they escorted us into the home where Paul Brand grew up and took us to the graves. And one by one, they had served a lunch. One by one, they told the story of many of them being adopted by Granny Brand. 30 different women she adopted when they were little babies, abandoned by parents who didn't want them. And she raised them, educated them, and some of them were doctors and nurses now. They had come from all over South India to honor Paul Brand, who was with me. We went from there to London, England. And in London, Paul Brand showed me the places where he trained. We went on the rooftop where he and Margaret were fire watchers. This is during the Blitz. Every night, German planes would come over and bomb London. It was a terrible time for the country, but it was a great time for medical students because you got to see everything. Every night there was trauma. There was something to treat. And that's where they learned medicine. And then we went to the Royal College of Surgeons. He was a member of that Royal College, and after being at the Kali Hills, where we were treated like princes, and flowers, garlands were put around our necks, and we were given feasts, and people sang hymns to us. It didn't happen that way in London. Paul Brand was an elderly man by then. He had trouble figuring out the subway system, the tube, and he didn't wear the most fashionable clothes. And when we got to the College of Surgeons, the receptionist there treated him rudely. "What are you doing?" "We're about to close." And I wanted to grab her and say, "Do you realize who this is?" But I said, "We're not going to take long. We just wanted to look. There's room here, the Hall of Fame." So we went down this hallway. It was a darkened hallway. We found a way to turn on some lights. And behind these dusty frames were some photos of the great professors that Paul Brand had studied under. And he'd stop at each one and tell me the story, what he had learned, plastic surgery, and different professors and the skills. And as I compared those two visits to the Kali Hills and the Royal College of Surgeons, they stood out so sharply. And I thought, what would Paul Brand's life have been like if he had stayed in London, if he had joined University College or gone to Harvard Medical School or places like that? He had the invitations. He could have had those positions. What would his life have been like? Even in this place, his contributions were so recognized that he received all these awards. In a proper laboratory, he possibly could have gotten a Nobel Prize in medicine. And then what? And then what? He would hang in this dusty hallway along with the other professors. Things change fast in medicine. People are forgotten. Instead, Paul Brand's legacy continues primarily through people like Sadagopan. There's a passage in the letters of Paul. Paul says to the Corinthians, he's giving a kind of resume, a curriculum vitae. He says, "You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts." Today, as I was going around visiting some people who still knew Paul Brand, they would tell me of patients who converted to Christianity and they needed to find a Christian name for their son, and they would name him Paul. There are Pauls all over this part of the world named for Paul Brand. I told the story in one of our books that took place here where Dr. Brand was training some medical students, and he was watching this one who was interviewing a woman. They were in a very sensitive area, and the medical student was palpating her abdomen, and he needed to find some information about her, and it was a little delicate, and it took a lot of care, it took a lot of sensitivity, and Dr. Brand was shocked. And after the examination, he turned to this medical student and said, "You look exactly like my professor, Robin Pilcher." Because as he was doing the exam, he had this kind of compassionate and curious and inviting expression on his face. His one eyebrow arched upward, he had a particular smile. He said, "How did you know that? Robin Pilcher has never been to Vellore, and you've never been to England, have you?" And the medical student looked at him and said, I don't know Robin Pilcher. Dr. Brand, that was your face. That was your expression. And that may still be true. All over this school, there are people who bear the face, the expression of Ida Scudder, Paul Brand, Robert Cochran, people like that. And not only that, through you, people like you, the letters of God are written on the hearts of patients. I had one last chance to see Paul Brand. July 17, just a few weeks ago, was the 100th anniversary of his birth. As you know, he died just 1 week before he turned 89, just before his 60th wedding anniversary. He had a fall. There was bleeding inside his brain. I was on the way to New Zealand, but I was able to reroute my airplane itinerary so I could stop by in Seattle and say goodbye. His head was shaved. They were debating various procedures to relieve the hematoma in his brain, most of which was no longer functioning. He was curled up in a fetal position. I looked down on this man who had been my mentor, my father for 30 years. This giant of a man, his brain was now locked away, no longer functioning. I reached down to grab his hand, and the old instincts kicked in. Even though he was unconscious, he began examining my hand with his, much like he examined Pauline's foot. What he had learned in this place 60 years before had become a reflex so deep it outlived his conscious mind. After a few minutes, I let go to walk the rest of my life and career alone without him. When I visited Sadagopan's house, he had a photo on the wall behind him. After he told me his story in his peculiar sing-song voice, I looked closely at the photo, and it had a caption. The photo was of Paul and Margaret Brand, and it said this: "May the Spirit of the God who lives in them live also in me, and in you, and in this great institution that even now reflects so much of that Spirit." Amen.